IVM.
Even as COVID-19 ravages health and food systems, as well as financial investments, the global alternative protein sector is basking in the afterglow of a massive year. Our State of the Industry reports show that investment in alternative protein companies was the highest ever in 2019 and was showing a very strong upward trend even during the current crisis.
Despite economic instability, difficulties for food service, and an unfolding public health crisis, by Q1 2020, the investment world was really embracing our thesis that plant-based, cultivated, and fermentation-based meat, egg, and dairy are not just alternative protein, but smart protein. It's an indication of how the entire food system can coalesce towards an idea whose time has come, and how innovation can drive an entire sector forward.
$824 million was invested in the sector in 2019, by far its biggest year ever. And Q1 2020 blew even that full year's total out of the water, with $930 million invested between January and March. Now, these totals are across all categories of smart protein, with plant-based foods leading the way, and cultivated meat scaling record new heights at a breathtaking pace. What's more, 9 of the top 10 US meat companies have now capitalized on the plant-based shift, having launched, bought, or collaborated on a plant-based meat brand by the end of 2019.
Clearly, the last year has been groundbreaking for plant-based food. And we're also on the cusp of making secure, sustainable, and cultivated meat a reality. But much of this progress is centered in the US. The Indian and broader Asian market is currently gaining momentum, but some way behind. How are financial and corporate investors around the world thinking about this relatively nascent geography? Today's guest on Feeding 10 Billion can offer some clues.
Andrew Ive is a bit of a legend in the food investor field, having led and grown a fund called FoodX, the #1 global food accelerator backed by parent fund S02. He has been one of the most active seed investors with over 40 food investments and is a board member of the Tufts Nutrition Council. He has a Harvard Business School degree and has worked at Procter & Gamble as well as Lloyd's Bank.
Recently, Andrew set up a hybrid venture capital firm, Big Idea Ventures, focused on solving the world's biggest problems like climate change, health, and animal welfare by investing in entrepreneurs with solutions to those problems. BIV, as it's called, has a new protein fund for companies making plant-based foods, ecosystem drivers like technology and ingredients, as well as cultivated meat, eggs, and dairy. They've raised nearly $50 million and plan to invest in hundreds of companies with a biannual accelerator. The latest cohort also has one Indian plant-based egg company, Evo Foods. I'm Ramya Ramurthy, the communication specialist at the Good Food Institute India.
And I'm Varun Deshpande, Managing Director at the Good Food Institute India. And you're listening to Feeding 10 Billion. So Andrew, can you talk us through your personal journey? So you're someone who's worked in Procter & Gamble, in consumer products, at IBM, at Lloyd's Private Banking, and now you're focused on solving global food concerns via the solutions created by companies that you back through Big Idea Ventures. Can you talk us through your journey of how you got from there to here?
Sure. I wish I could say there was a consistent logic that goes through every decision I've ever made in regards to my career. I've certainly taken some kind of 90-degree, turns when I should have gone straight forward or whatever. But I can rationalize some of the decisions in hindsight and maybe give some kind of flavor to it. So at Procter & Gamble, I was very focused on a very traditional brand management function. So starting and growing, or rather growing and extending existing brands. Strangely, during that time, I was asked to discontinue a brand that wasn't profitable or successful. And instead of just getting rid of it, which was the objective, to kind of go in one weekend with a bunch of people with big black plastic bags and take the product off the shelves, I really wanted to understand why it wasn't working. And that sort of got me into the thought process of, what does it take to make a great business? What are the fundamentals? How do we get consumers to really love it? I ultimately went back to the board and instead of agreeing with them to take the product off the shelf, proposed a very inexpensive turnaround plan for the brand. And For whatever reason, they backed the plan, they backed me, and we ultimately changed that business, turned it around, and within a year or so, I think they sold it to a different company for, $20-30 million or so. So that kind of got me really fundamentally into working with businesses that were having some challenges and figuring out how to make them resonate and successful and relevant to consumers. IBM was actually a role between first and second year at business school. I had a 4 to 5 month gap, and I really had considered relocating from the US to Asia. And so I was offered an opportunity to work with IBM World Trade Asia out of Singapore. And in my summer months, I went from Boston to Singapore and worked at IBM. The role there was launching printers and mainframes and things like that across the Asia market. I also built a new leasing business for them in Malaysia and the Philippines. So that kind of solidified my passion and my love for kind of Asia and Southeast Asia. So it wasn't a logical decision from a business perspective, but it really was me exploring the kind of, would I like to live full time in a place outside of the UK and outside of the US? Lloyd's Private Bank, I wish I could say there was a logic to it. They just offered me an inordinate amount of money. And I was kind of twiddling my thumbs at the time. I'd just exited a business, and the kind of pound sterling or dollar signs caught my attention. They basically sold me on the idea of an entrepreneur helping to turn around a bank that was, 500-600 years old and wanted to kind of come into the new century, as it were. And they wanted me to help them figure out how to do that. So I thought it was quite entrepreneurial, but the reality is a bank that is 400 or 500 years has somewhat embedded approaches to their business and ways of thinking about it. And even one lone entrepreneur isn't really going to be able to make much of a dent in that. So how did I get to kind of focusing on turning around and working with businesses in the kind of plant-based space, the hybrid venture capital firm, etc. That came about because I took over responsibility very early on for one of the world's first food tech accelerators, and invested in that time at around 40 seed stage companies across the whole food category. Got really, really passionate about food being at the center of some of the solutions we need as a species, whether it's, providing food for ourselves as we increase our population, but also more fundamentally, if we change some of the consumption habits we have around food, we have the potential to have a more sustainable footprint on this planet. And thankfully, and this is always important for an ex kind of Procter & Gamble person, the consumers are going in the right direction. It's not something we have to persuade people to do. It's not something we have to use marketing to try and, encourage people to do. More and more consumers around the world are recognizing both the health benefits, the planet benefits, and also the kind of animal welfare benefits of a whole range of great innovative foods that are coming online from entrepreneurs around the world, whether that's, Asia, Southeast Asia, US, Europe. And as someone who's been involved in backing and working with young entrepreneurs, and by young, I don't mean young in age, just young in attitude and stage of business, those businesses have the ability to deliver great products to consumers that they're actually begging for, but also have a far lower impact on the world we live in and the kind of how we treat the animals that are part of the planet we live on. So, there's multiple dimensions to this.
So, Andrew, you've been a turnaround specialist. You've, obviously tried to solve some of the world's biggest problems like climate change or health and animal welfare through the Big Idea Ventures initiative. Now, you have a new protein fund that's specifically looking at plant-based foods and ecosystem drivers like technology or ingredients, as well as cultivated meat, eggs, and dairy. So when you're working, you work with a 500-year-old bank, but this is pretty much like a nascent sector, which is, you're doing a lot of early ecosystem building. How crucial is that? And, how big a role does innovation play? So what are you thinking of when you invest in these companies? Is it just the scope of the problems that you're solving, or the fact that you are the early bird in a sector with tremendous promise for returns?
Yeah, that's a multifaceted question, and there's a multifaceted answer. This is an incredibly exciting category from a finance perspective, from an investment perspective. There have been innovations in the food category over the last 50 years. They're generally extensions of existing products. They're sort of slightly moving the ball forward, as it were, in terms of innovation. That's why they talk about brand extensions. In this case, in the case of plant-based food, it's a fundamental shift. It's a complete white space opportunity that is getting filled in on a daily basis by new brands, new products, new companies around the world. So if you walk through a grocery store and you walk down an aisle and you consider all of the products that surround you, and if you just consider all of those products which currently contain an animal protein, either a fat or a dairy or an egg kind of binder or whatever it might be, all of those products that have animal protein as either a main component or a sub-component, all of them are replaceable and improvable through a plant-based innovation of some kind. And the great thing is that the consumers around the world, and I would have excluded certain places in this kind of around the world statement maybe 6 months ago. We were seeing a lot of growth and innovation coming through from entrepreneurs in the US, from Europe, from Asia. And I was starting to think that kind of mainland China and Africa and other places like that would come online from a demand perspective in the next 5 years or so. But the reality is it's starting to happen far faster and far sooner than even I was anticipating. So from an investment perspective, it's incredibly exciting. From an innovation perspective, the entrepreneurs are stepping up and responding to the consumer demand. And I think that's the fundamentally most important thing. This is not a marketing-driven trend from a few food companies who are kind of tapping into an opportunity. This is consumers, millennials, Gen Y, Gen X, basically saying, we want product that's clean label, that's nutritious, that has far lower impact on the planet, on animals, and is healthier. And high demands, high demands. That's not an easy target to hit, but there's a lot of entrepreneurs around the world, and we've invested in many of them, and we're going to continue to invest in them. A lot of entrepreneurs out there who are hitting those targets. And even if they miss them slightly, because I think in the plant-based category, some of the foods have been criticized in the past for not being that much healthier than their traditional animal protein counterparts. But I think the companies and the innovators in this space, in the plant-based space, are starting to get it right in terms of the ingredient set, in terms of the cleaner labels, how they're able to get great taste, great price, and not load it up with too many ingredients. So from an innovation perspective, it's a very exciting category. From an investment perspective, Q1 this year, so January through March, more investment went into plant-based food companies than the entire year previous. So it's heating up from an investment opportunity perspective. Overall, the category is just, very, very exciting, both in terms of what's happening, but also the impact that it can have.
Totally, Andrew. And I agree that it's a very high bar to set for entrepreneurs, but also that they can meet it over time, particularly with, as you said, the ingredients that are coming to the fore and the enabling ecosystem that's coming to the fore. In order to meet that bar, though, which is basically saying, let's make sure everything tastes the same or better and costs the same or less for every geography, especially in a geography like India where people are very price sensitive, but they will not sacrifice the taste aspect of it. How are you thinking in terms of balancing risk and reward? So how do you think about the risk of some of these companies and the very ambitious targets they're setting, some of the capital burdens that they might have in order to get there?
The one thing I love about the plant-based industry in particular, but also the one thing I love about food as an industry, and I've worked in many industries at this point, it's a very supportive and very collaborative industry. Companies and partners and people want each other to succeed. It's not something I've seen very often across other industries. So, for example, a lot of the plant-based food companies that we invest in are getting a lot of support from the larger food companies who see them both as innovators, as also opportunities for new product development and opportunities for new products, new markets in the future. For example, we've established a really good relationship with Bühler out of Switzerland. Bühler is, top 1 or 2 globally in terms of food processing equipment. They work with some of the best and biggest food companies around the world to process and create great plant-based and other kind of broader food stuffs. They're firmly behind this category as a kind of market leader. They're innovating. They're working with us to help our companies to make sure that they're able to scale, to make sure that they're able to produce good quality, consistent products. They're investing in the space. They're working collaboratively with us and others around, in China, in Singapore, and other places around the world. So there will be some companies, young companies in this category that don't succeed. Absolutely, it can't not happen. There will be companies that fail. Absolutely. When we get applications for our fund, for our accelerator in Singapore, in New York, we're getting 200 plus companies applying from around the world for investment, for support, for mentorship. We choose 10, maybe 12 of those 200 companies. So there's already a significant filter from our perspective on, we try to find and invest in the best of those 200 companies. Once we've invested in those 200 companies, we don't just kind of write them a check and hope they do okay, which is the typical model for most investors. What we do is we have, 100 plus mentors across the food industry, covering pretty much every dimension of the business of food that you can think of. And those mentors and, my dedicated team work with those companies full time for 5 months, which equates to about 800 hours of dedicated time on each company. And we unpack that business. We kind of understand it in a very fundamental way and get it to the point where it's a great product, a strong team, and a scalable business. Because one of the things that young companies in the food space typically have issues with and fall over due to is scale, figuring out how to go from making it by hand in a commercial kitchen, which is the very kind of first or typical approach to starting a food company, ultimately moving from that stage to the point where you've got the right ingredient companies providing the ingredients, you've got the right co-manufacturers building the product and producing the product for you consistently in the right hygienic conditions, and having the capability of being able to scale that production both domestically but also potentially internationally. And that's what we focus in on. We've got 2 PhD food scientists on staff who work with the companies right at the beginning in terms of making sure that the product and the recipe and the ingredients are optimized and perfect. We then kind of work with partners across the food industry who want our companies to succeed, to make sure that they've got the support they need across the value chain of ingredients, flavor companies, co-manufacturers, even through to distribution, retail, food service. It's an ecosystem which can be brought to bear to help these companies to be more likely to survive and successful. And by the way, I would loop GFI into that, that equation. GFI has a fundamentally strong, science folks, people who really understand the ecosystem of the food industry, understand where the industry is going. They bring, their partnership prowess to bear. So there's a lot of people in the ring with the startup companies, wanting them and helping them to be as successful as possible. Will some fail? Absolutely, yes. Will we be able to mitigate that to some degree? I hope so. Will we be able to make some of those companies, global and doing the right thing across the planet? I believe we will.
Fantastic. Yeah. Thank you so much, Andrew. And one of those partnerships that you mentioned that GFI India just set up is with an ingredients company called AAK. It's a Nordic company out of Sweden, Denmark, and they have a presence in India. We're going to be building advisory services and innovation center for plant-based meat, egg, dairy applications in Mumbai. And we're going to do this with multiple other companies as well, right? You mentioned a little bit about Tyson Ventures, partnerships with Bühler, other firms in Singapore. Could you speak a little bit to what are the biggest bottlenecks when you're engaging with these corporate partners? What are they saying to you in terms of hurdles the companies need to get over before this is interesting to them?
So a lot of these companies are convinced that this is a kind of a step change in the food industry. This is not just a trend or a fad, but is actually a shift in consumption. And I think there are a lot of companies in the food industry who have come to that conclusion and are starting to think about how do they respond to it. Some of the large companies consider it a threat, and they're using regulation and definition of particular items in the FDA and that sort of thing as a way of kind of trying to push back on the changes that are inevitable. But I think fundamentally what a lot of the food companies in particular have come to the conclusion of is that this is happening. It is inevitable. And if they're, smart and strategic about it, they will, tap into this change and be part of the solutions that are coming in terms of the great products and the ingredients and the technologies to make those great products available to the consumers that are demanding them. Again, if it wasn't for the consumers saying we want these things, it wouldn't persevere as a kind of change in the in the marketplace. But coming directly back to the question in terms of what are the bottlenecks, what are some of the resistance, I think there are some companies who have done things in a very focused and traditional way over the last 50, 60, 70 years. They've got used to doing things in a certain way. They've got a culture internally that is very intransigent, traditional. People who are used to producing the same product on a consistent basis and imagining that the market will always be there for those products. Those kind of companies are going to find the next 5 to 10 years very, very difficult. And they're already starting to see the kind of market share of their traditional products starting to be eroded by either young companies that are coming online with their own iterations or evolutions of those products, or some of their kind of competitors who are seeing the opportunity and are jumping in, feet first to take advantage of the innovation and the products coming online. This is the companies that are starting to engage in this category. They're either doing it through investing or partnering with the younger companies that are bringing the innovations to the market, or they're creating duplicate products, kind of Me Too, equivalents to the Beyond, or not even equivalents, but, kind of their own versions of the Beyond and the Impossible as an example. So the traditional food companies are responding in different ways. Some of them are innovating by partnering with young companies. Some of them are backing those companies and wanting to kind of help them to become successful. Some of them are kind of copying what's happening in the market and hoping they can kind of keep some of that market share. And then other food companies are sort of putting their head in the sand and hoping that this is just a short-term thing and everything will go back to normal eventually. I think I know who I believe will survive, the changes that are already in process.
That's really fascinating, Andrew. So in India, when it comes to building the local ecosystem here, the approach is to obviously have homegrown companies that create exciting products for this market. But it's also a market for international companies to partner with local ingredient suppliers or research institutes. So there are just so many ways in which India can position itself in the global ecosystem of new protein. So when it comes to partnerships and connecting local companies to international ones and building value chains, what do you think are the advantages that international companies offer local ecosystems, and what should they be wary of?
So, great question. Thank you. So I'm sure Varun has some kind of potential input on this particular question. But one of the things that occurs is that in India in particular, there's a significant opportunity in the global plant-based category as far as ingredients is concerned. Over the last 5 years or so, soy, wheat, pea protein have become key ingredients and very important ingredients for the plant-based food category. as the price of those three ingredients increases, given, demand steadily increasing for plant-based foods, we see new ingredients becoming more and more important and relevant to the plant-based food space. So, for example, chickpea is a potential replacer for some of the other plant-based ingredients. So I think India has a significant opportunity, both from a local company and larger company in the global plant-based category. But I think in a sense that shortchanges India's role and opportunity for, the plant-based food space. We've just made an investment, for example, in a company called Evo Foods, a team of people out of Mumbai who have developed a plant-based egg product that we believe has global potential. They in the short term are focusing on the India market. They see a big opportunity for that product. So plant-based egg in multiple kind of formats. They see an opportunity for that, whether it's in the QSR kind of restaurant space with having kind of plant-based egg in a sandwich or multiple kind of iterations of that product. And we also are kind of desperate for them to launch that product in the United States because there's a huge demand for products just like this. So, that would be a successful business that was very much a tiny company, homegrown in India. So I think in Southeast Asia and in Asia overall, India is probably one of the most entrepreneurial places that there is. Yes, there's the opportunity for ingredients. Yes, there's the opportunity for entrepreneurship. I kind of don't want India to think of itself, not that there's this kind of homogeneous thought process of a country, but, I don't want India to think of itself as a net exporter of innovation or ingredients and not to really think of itself as a marketplace for these products. We've seen the consumers in the US and in Europe and in other places really grabbing hold of plant-based foods and bring it into their houses and their lifestyles and starting to adopt it as a kind of an approach. In India, I really hope, and Varun probably has a point of view on this, I really hope that the population of India grabs hold of the innovation that's happening in the plant-based category and see it as a way of reconciling their kind of vegetarian heritage, but yet giving them the experiences and the kind of tastes, opportunities of a broader set of products.
Yeah, absolutely, Andrew. I think it is a great point. I do think that India has multiple value propositions for this sector, and the value of this sector to India is also manyfold or multifold. And India is incredibly complex. Like you said, it cannot be viewed as homogenous because anything that you say about India is true, and its opposite is also true because it's such a weird and complex country, and a great and complex country. I do think, we have this cohort of people in India that are, upwardly mobile, urban, have disposable income, thinking in terms of the eating for the planet, eating for human and planetary health. So they're kind of eating like their global counterparts. They're eating like people in Sydney, eating like the same cohorts in New York, in Singapore, etc. And I think that that's the early adopter market. But the real prize, like you said, Andrew, is people adopting this wholesale, people looking at plant-based foods and plant-based protein and eventually fermentation, cultivated meat, etc., thinking of it as a vehicle to address those deep-seated cultural resonance that they have, like you said, for really being kind to animals and to the planet. I think that that's something that's deep-seated in our heritage. And so by definition, we might have people who are guilty if they're non-vegetarian, guilty about it to a certain degree. And I think that this is a great opportunity to address that. On that note, we're going to take a quick break and we will be right back with Andrew Ive of Big Idea Ventures.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. If you're not following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. I'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Paytm Money and Intel. Really, really fun week. And I think that you guys should definitely check out some of the stuff we did. So we had Shifa Mehta, who is the host of the show Smile India, on the Paperback Podcast. Really fun thing. On Edges and Sledges, our hosts had an episode just amongst themselves. No guests this time. Really fun show with lots of cool banter. I think you'll enjoy that quite a bit. On Storytellers and Storysellers, Vineet had Shrishti Bell on. Shrishti is the head of Netflix in India, and I think you'll really enjoy that conversation as well. Also, do check out Uncle Please Sit. Joel and Tushar had Anuya Chatakar on. Anuya hosts the popular YouTube channel Books on Toast. And don't forget others of your old favorites like The Habit Coach, Football Should Ball, All Things Policy. All of them are doing a great job during this pandemic, and you should definitely check them out. And with that, let's get you back to your show.
Welcome back. We're talking big ideas with Andrew Ive of Big Idea Ventures. Andrew, at GFI India, you know we're keen on leveraging indigenous crops, R&D talent pools, ingenious entrepreneurs, like you said, and then Indian solutions to solve for Indian problems like nutrition, water scarcity, climate change, environmental degradation, global poverty, human health, animal welfare. There's all of these problems, right? And you need big ideas to target these problems. So what do you think is the need of the hour for Indian entrepreneurs and the sector to be focusing on to ensure that we stay at the cutting edge of this sector? Because you mentioned that we shouldn't only see ourselves as a sourcing market for the rest of the world. How do we stay at the cutting edge to tackle these problems locally as well?
I think it comes back to some of the things we've already been talking about, i.e. the ecosystem that needs to be put in place and needs to be built by organizations like GFI, like ours, like, the Indian government and so on. We need to be encouraging the ecosystem to surround those entrepreneurs in India to make sure that they are able to produce and scale great products in a sustainable and efficient way. So, for example, by bringing on board or bringing into the ecosystem companies which are innovating around packaging, around the production process of food, so that the CO2 footprint is lower, so that the packaging that the products are sold in are biodegradable and compostable, and the other things that we should be striving for, not obviously oil, plastic based, etc. I don't think all of these responsibilities should be put on the shoulders of the entrepreneurs to solve, because I think it's just a lot, right? They should be focusing on creating a great range of products that hit the taste, price, consistent product goals that we have. The young companies should be focused on producing and delivering those products to very, very happy consumers. What we need to do, like GFI, like Big Idea Ventures, like some of the larger food companies that surround these innovators, is make sure that there are the right partners and choices available in terms of production, packaging, ingredients, and so on. If we're smart, we help these entrepreneurs to do the right thing in the right way from the very beginning. And that starts at the innovation, but also goes all the way through to, a mass-produced product that is available in India and further.
So, Andrew, you've seen from the inside of big companies what scale looks like, right? Especially at Procter & Gamble, I would say, but also with your dealings with Tyson Ventures, Tyson Foods, and other companies that you've worked with or collaborated with. Now, you talked about taste, price, and convenience and scaling up as the way forward. Particularly in low and middle income countries, as we talked about earlier, you have to crack all of these at the same time to a great degree, or at least as the sector grows, you have to satisfy these things as a sector. Individual companies can position at the top of the market, the middle of the market, or whatever. But how do we get to price parity for alternative protein products? Because people tend to say, isn't this too expensive currently? Why would it work in India, etc.? Could you talk a little bit about how you actually get to price parity at scale and how that works from an industry standpoint?
So Impossible created a range of plant-based products, so meat, burger, etc., plant-based ground meat and burgers, for example. Their initial way of tackling the market was to focus on thought leaders, to focus on getting their product into key restaurants in small volume, and to be able to have those thought leaders talk about how great their product was and how innovative and how you can use it in all the same ways as you would use regular ground meat. Those products, I'm sure, weren't hitting from a cost perspective a particular target, because what they were more concerned about was creating momentum for their brand, for their company. So I'm sure that they weren't producing those products at the same price as ground meat when you take probably the worst bits of an animal and grind it up into a paste effectively. So I don't think in the beginning you can actually focus on price. In the beginning, I think with most companies in the plant-based category, in any category for that matter, any company that's producing a new product, when it's not at scale, is generally a more expensive product to produce. That's just the kind of economics of production. And I don't think that's specific to plant-based. I think that's common to all production. If you're producing something in small quantities, the setup costs and the costs of producing that product are generally higher. So if you're trying to hit taste, price, and convenience, scale and volume is critical for that equation to work. How do you get to the volume necessary so that you can produce a great tasting, inexpensive product that is good quality? The answer to that question is volume and scale. In the short term, you're not going to have that volume and scale. So what you then should be doing, I guess, is focusing in on those specific categories or sectors of the consumers who are prepared to pay a little bit more or potentially a lot more for products that are, great tasting, convenient, and, deliver on healthier ingredients. So volume is key. How do you get to volume? You basically get consumers tasting your product, loving your product, and wanting to integrate it into their daily lives. And, we saw in the US, for example, with Beyond, moving that product, their first kind of product, from the kind of vegan/vegetarian section of the store into the meat section, where a regular consumer who generally eats meat can try it, like it, and continue to purchase it. That's how you get volume. You make it transition from being a product that's only interesting for a few to a product that's demanded by the many.
Andrew, so we've talked about, what value Indian entrepreneurs can offer to the new protein or the smart protein ecosystem, as we like to call it. And we've talked about indigenous ingredients and affordable talent, as well as innovation that's very price sensitive. We also work together on getting applications to your current cohort going. And you mentioned Mumbai-based Evo Foods was selected. So can you talk a bit about what are the general trends that you observe from that group?
So the Evo Foods was a company that, GFI, Varun introduced us to. Great company, great team, great product. We're very, very excited about them. We've had, as I mentioned, 200 plus companies applying. We ended up taking 12 companies in the second cohort. With Evo Foods, we've got our first India company coming into our portfolio. We've also got companies from Australia, from the US, from Europe, and Singapore actually coming online as part of our second portfolio. In this case, in the second cohort, we chose companies which were cell-based more than we would normally do, mainly because many parts of the world are on lockdown. And we felt that companies which were focused on moving their technology forward, which is typically where the cell-based companies are focused at the moment. Being on lockdown was something that would be helpful or at least conducive or wouldn't get in the way of those companies that are moving those technologies forward. So, for example, plant-based food companies are very much about relationships. So it's very much a business of finding the right ingredient companies, the right co-manufacturers, establishing relationships with different retail buyers. It's a very outward-facing type of business. In terms of cell-based companies, most of them are at the stage where it's very much about R&D. So it's a very inward-facing type of business model right now. So given the lockdown, we made the conscious decision in the second cohort to invest in more cell-based companies. For example, we've got a cell-based company which is developing honey. That'll be the first, 100% vegan honey company. They're basically creating all different kinds of honey for different grades of different flavors using cell-based technology and fermentation. And at the cell level, it has the exact same composition as regular honey. we think that's a kind of a very interesting company. But we've got a whole range of interesting companies. We've got a company out of Antwerp in Belgium that's developing cell-based fat, which sounds sort of odd. Why would you want a company that's developing fat? But interestingly, fat is one of the key things that make things taste good to us as human beings. So by being able to create a cell-based fat, that's something, for example, that can be integrated into other products, make some great tasting products.
So Andrew, you're scaling up from a 50 million fund to a 100 million fund maybe, and looking at hundreds of companies that you want to invest in the coming years. You're doing 2 accelerators each year, and you're going through a round of companies that are doing very exciting things in this sector. How do you, looking at what you've achieved so far and what you want to achieve in the future, how do you define success for yourself, and what does it look like? Can you paint a picture for how the alt protein or the smart protein market will look like in the coming years? Are we actually on track to supplying more than half the world's protein supply in the next 10 years, as some reports have predicted? Or do you think there are too many challenges before we get there?
So in terms of, Andrew Ive, what does success look like for me personally? I set out to do this about 2 years ago as I hit my 50th birthday. I wanted to make sure that the next 10 years of my full-time career, and I consider that, assuming my wife is still talking to me when I'm 60, which I think I'm on track for it at the moment, but assuming my wife is still talking to me when I'm 60, I'm intending to go kind of part-time at that point in time. So the next 10 years for me is about deploying the kind of lessons I've learned, the mistakes I've made, to try and work with great people, both in terms of entrepreneurs, but also, companies like GFI, like Bühler, like Tyson, etc., to work with some great companies to help create an industry globally, which will allow us as a species to survive the next, 50 to 100 years without hardship. And I want to be able to walk away from a career when I'm 60 that is a net benefit to the planet that's been so good to me over the last kind of 52 years. I ideally want us as a people to be able to provide not just for key parts of the world that have wealth, but also, the rest of the world that isn't as fortunate. And I think plant-based foods and cell-based foods give us the capability to provide for our entire species. I think it also gives us the capability of being able to do so without damaging the planet further than we already have, maybe even rolling back some of the damage that we've done. So, I've got a 17-year-old daughter. She has spent the last few years accusing me and my generation of doing some terrible things. And it would be wonderful if, we all could work together to kind of make things a little better in terms of, the planet we're in. The 2-degree change in temperature scares me. And, I could have spent the next 10 years focusing on wealth creation, which is unfortunately what I probably spent the last, 30 years on. Instead, I wanted to focus on, flattening the curve of climate change and improving kind of the situation of animal welfare. Now, strangely, being able to do that is not incongruous with being able to create wealth, because I believe that there's such an opportunity amongst consumers around the world for great tasting, inexpensive, convenient plant-based foods, that a lot of the products and brands that we know today will either evolve or cease to exist over the next decade. And I think a lot of those brands and products will be replaced by younger companies and their products who come into the market with better tasting, less expensive products, which will become the new, and I'm not singling out any company, but these are just the brands I'm thinking of, will become the new Campbell Soup companies, the new General Mills, the new Kellogg companies of the future. And it'll either happen in partnership with the existing food companies that have been around for the last 100 years, or it will replace them. And I think whether it's a replacing of those brands and those companies or in partnership is entirely at the discretion or the decision making of the current food establishment. They can either, get on board with what's happening amongst the consumers, or they can fight against it. But ultimately, I believe consumers are demanding great tasting, inexpensive foods that has a lower impact on the planet. And I think the large food companies need to recognize this and realize that they can succeed and achieve their own objectives by partnering with these young food companies through, companies like mine. We find these companies generally before these large food companies. We work with them. We help them. We help them to scale and become successful. We want to do that in partnership with the existing food establishment, not in place of. I think this is going to become good for everybody if we all kind of partner together and find a way of bringing great tasting, inexpensive, low impact foods to the consumers around the world. And I think that's one of the biggest opportunities we've seen in the food industry in decades.
That's inspiring stuff, Andrew. And I agree 100% that this all starts and ends with people. And whether that's consumers, whether that's farmers, whether that's people that work in large companies, whether that's entrepreneurs, all of us have to work together to feeding 10 billion by 2050. So our final question for you today is, how do you think we will be feeding 10 billion of us? What will your day look like in 2050?
If I do the math on 2050, I will be 80 years old. So with any luck, my day will be hanging out with my grandchildren and my wife and my daughter and, appreciating getting to 80 years old and and not having had a heart attack or being run over by a bus or something. But in terms of, what will it look like for the planet and kind of this industry? Hopefully we've got, the majority of people in the world who are moved out of poverty and are focused on great lives and collaborative lives together. It's interesting to me that over the last 50 to 60, 70 years, the food industry got very focused on large volumes of high caloric, inexpensive foods, kind of producing food that would appeal to the lowest common denominator. And I think the consequence of that, at least in places where that food was ubiquitous, is health problems, obesity, and other things. I think we're getting smarter, at least in the places where there's a availability of a lot of food, that it's not so much about calories and we can actually achieve great taste without that calorie overload. So I think what the food industry will be moving towards over the next 30 years is high nutrition, lower processed, cleaner label foods that taste great and, are inexpensive. And I think if we all get smarter about choosing those foods over their kind of high calorie counterparts, we'll all be healthier as a population. That also gives us the capability, and it comes back to that scale question that we had halfway through the podcast. I think plant-based foods, for example, give us the capability of being able to provide at scale inexpensive, nutritious foods that we can get to people who don't currently, from a wealth perspective, have the ability to consume enough food. So I think this is not only a solution in terms of the health and well-being of our species, but it also gives us the availability of getting foods to as many people as possible. I think it gives us the ability to provide food for the 10 billion.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for joining us for this episode of Feeding 10 Billion. If we wanted to reach you, or if people who are listening to this podcast wanted to get in touch with you, what's the best way to do that?
Perfect. So in terms of Big Idea Ventures, the company, they should just come to bigideaventures.com. There's a contact us page there. We love speaking and meeting with new entrepreneurs. We love speaking and meeting with anyone who wants to be a mentor or any companies that want to be part of the ecosystem, whether it's ingredients, co-manufacturers, distributors, retailers, food service, whatever. And if it's investors, here's my cell phone number. No, I'm just kidding. Come along to either bigideaventures.com or find me on LinkedIn. That's also a good platform for engaging with me personally and also with our company. There is a Big Idea Ventures page on LinkedIn.
Thanks so much, Andrew. We'll just include the number in the notes on the episode.
Yeah, I'll share your number with everyone. Don't worry, Andrew. Thank you so much.
All right, guys. I really appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Catalytic capital has been a theme on Feeding 10 Billion. We've talked to agri-tech investment pioneers Mark Khan of Omnivore and Hemendra Mathur of Bharat Innovation Fund, and now Andrew Ive, about how Indian entrepreneurs bring unique experiences and ingenuity to the table in agri-tech, in food broadly, and, of course, in smart protein. But with the media and financial world so deeply excited about this space and all its momentum, it's crucial for us all to keep our eyes on the ball. We're still right at the beginning of a decades-long shift, and we need international partnerships with the likes of Big Idea Ventures to spur interest and support for the Indian smart protein sector.
If you're listening to this, you'll be interested to know that we may have some exciting news to share with BIV on India soon. But you need both sides of the equation, a thriving ecosystem to support it, and a wellspring of ingenious, uniquely Indian entrepreneurs to take up the mission for smart protein. As always, if you want to start a company in this space or are interested in learning more about this sector as a researcher, or simply want to collaborate, please do reach out. You can also join our GF Ideas India Smart Protein Innovation community on LinkedIn or follow us on social media. We are at Good Food India on Twitter and the Good Food Institute India on Instagram, and we leave our LinkedIn URL in our description.
If you like this podcast, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can listen to us on the IVM Podcast app or ivmpodcasts.com. You can also follow us on our social media. We are at IVM Podcasts on Twitter and Instagram. And if you want to reach out to me, I am at VarunD7 on Twitter and at Varun5 on Instagram. You can come ask me why.
And if you want to reach out to me, I'm Cryptic Caprice on Twitter and Dithering Funambulist on Instagram. Please don't ask me why. We look forward to having you with us every week. And of course, if you'd like to be part of accelerating the future of our food system, please just get in touch. You can email us at india@gfi.org.
My name is Varun Deshpande, Managing Director at the Good Food Institute India.
And I'm Ramya Ramurthy, the Communication Specialist at the Good Food Institute India. And you have been a part of Feeding 10 Billion Season 2.
Hi, my name is Anupam Gupta. I'm B50 on Twitter. I am the host of Paisa Vaisa, the show that talks money. On my show, I speak to experts from every field of money and finance, from stock markets, equities, debt funds, credit cards, life insurance, every possible area of money and finance that you can think of. We even did an episode on cryptocurrency. I've got fantastic guests from mutual funds to personal finance experts everywhere. Robo-advisory, startups, just name it, we've got it. At Paisa Vaisa, we help you make smart decisions about money. You work hard for money. Now make your money work hard for you. New episodes out every Monday, and you can listen to my show on the IVM Podcast app or any other podcasting app that you have.
Did I just catch you on your way to work? Or did you end up pulling an all-nighter? Let me guess. You have a packed schedule for the day, the week, and probably the month and the year. That's a lot for your mind to handle, don't you think? This buzzing chaos also brings tons of negative thoughts. Am I right? Try spinning that bottle in a positive direction with me, Chetna, on the Positively Unlimited podcast, every Monday on IBM Podcasts. It's time to change your life one alphabet at a time.